April 1945. A small rail siding outside a ruined town. The air tasted like coal dust and old smoke, and the cold pressed against skin like an accusation. Smoke hung low over shattered roofs, and the constant metallic squeal of rails gave the place an uneasy heartbeat. Miriam was 28, her hair cropped short to hide its thinning patches, her wrists carrying the pale remnant of a tattoo that had become more map than number. She moved among rows of makeshift barracks with a bundle of patched linens, fingers that had learned to fold grief into utility. Daniel was 23, a soldier in a muddy uniform, his boots thick with road salt and his eyes quick to catalog danger. He carried a small metal box of tools and, in the same pocket, a pressed photograph of an older sister who no longer sent letters. The first moment they noticed each other was not a meeting, but a coincidence of need. Miriam handed a child a slice of bread. Daniel watched her fingers. The bread fell once, and, for reasons he could not name, he stooped to pick it up and, with hands that smelled faintly of oil, tucked it back into the child's grasp. That act began a ledger of small favors that would add up to a life. The promise was immediate and quiet. This would be a story of repair and of choices that cut closer than bullets. It began with a button and a rusted bullet that would change what was given and what was owed. The tone is intimate and investigative. Miriam slept in a crowded barrack where the light came through torn canvas. The smell of boiled cabbage and disinfectant mingled with the iron tang of old blood. She mended coats at a folding table under a dim bulb, the stitches neat as vows. She had learned to read other people in the way their hands trembled when they reached for a cup. Her backstory was not a straight line, but a series of ruptures and a few stubborn salvations. She had once been a dressmaker in a city full of markets and the sound of tram bells. Her father had taught her to solder a button at 9 years old and to value small metal things as if they were hidden maps. Her mother had kept a ledger of family names that Miriam memorized like scripture. When transports took the men, her father and her brother were taken in separate convoys. Miriam survived by refusing to be invisible. After liberation, she had walked with a group of refugees until they found a former grain depot repurposed as a camp. There, she learned to make sourdough with nothing but water and patience, and turned broken metal into rings for children who wanted toys. Those rings would later become a symbol that stitched her life to another. The past lived in her hands, in the scar on her thumb from a needle that had once sewn a soldier's uniform in better times. In the camp, she found ways to trade skill for safety, and found that small mercies could accumulate into shelter. She kept a notebook with names and dates and small sketches of faces, a registry that she would not relinquish. Daniel had been a conscript. He had not wanted to be a soldier, and had not wanted the responsibilities that arrived with the uniform. He grew up on a farm where rain came like forgiveness, and where people fixed axles and mended fences out of necessity rather than ritual. At 17, he had left home to work in a factory, and then been taken. War rewired his sense of what counted as moral. He had been ordered to stand watch at transports and to ignore the living in the cars that rolled through. Once, when he was ordered to clear a car, he had found a child asleep on a bundle and had hidden a strip of bread in a pocket. He was punished mildly and then given orders that kept him distant. In captivity and in power, he learned to look for ways to give without being noticed. After the front moved, his patrols were smaller and the lines of command more frayed. He had an aptitude for fixing machines and for listening to the small complaints people made. In the weeks before meeting Miriam, he had been assigned to the rail siding to help unload supplies. He kept a small wooden box in his bunk where he polished bullets found in fields and imagined them remade. He had a habit of keeping a button in his palm when nervous, and of counting how many times he could rub the metal smooth. That tactile memory made him notice Miriam when she dropped bread and gave him the reason to bend. Daily life in the camp was repetition stitched with tiny rebellions. Mornings began with roll call under a high, cold sky where the sun felt like a promise deferred. Miriam rose with the barrack and rehearsed the tasks that kept others alive. She served in the infirmary most afternoons. The infirmary smelled like carbolic and warm linen and had a steady, low murmur of coughing. There she taught others how to lay a simple dressing and how to use a needle to close a jagged tear. Small objects held authority. A button taken from a uniform could pay for a cup of coffee or a story. A scrap of cloth folded just so could become a pocket. Daniel began to leave tools at the infirmary door. At first it was a wrench, then it was an old pocket knife whose blade had been sharpened until it sang. Their exchanges were never announced. They occurred bent over a table, in the shadow of a lantern, or by a cart of coal, where the smoke made everything softer at the edges. Sensory detail multiplied in these routines. The tang of soap on fingers, the rasp of wool on wool, the metallic note when a bullet was struck for smoothing, the quiet clink when a ring was dropped onto a wooden workbench, the taste of tea that Miriam offered to those with fevers, and the particular hush of voices when a child slept. Those small gestures became their language. The first clear conversation between Miriam and Daniel unfolded one night while rain shook the canvas above their heads and puddles memorized the stars. Miriam was at the sewing board, threading a needle, when Daniel arrived with a small coal stove to replace a rusted one. Their dialogue expanded, slow and precise, their voices leaning into each other like two tools finding contact. "You should not carry that alone," Miriam said, hands steady. "It is heavy," Daniel replied, wiping oil from his palms. "We can share the weight," Miriam offered, eyes on the needle. "Why do you help us?" Daniel asked, voice low. "Because someone once mended my sleeve," Miriam answered, smile small, "and I owe the kindness forward." "And the bullets," Daniel said, pointing at the small pile on the table. "Those are the rest of my failures," he said, half laugh. "Then make them promises," Miriam said. "Turn failures into promises." "How?" Daniel asked. "Forge," Miriam said simply. "Melt them down with a friend." The exchange grew, 5 times in measured beats, until both laughed at the absurdity. The dialogue showed not only a transaction of objects, but of intentions. The nighttime scene carried sensory layers. The stove barked, coal smoke curled into the fabric, and the smell of wet wool sat in the air like a quiet chorus. A small incident escalated into a wound that would forge trust. A transport arrived late one February morning, and with it a panic shoving that left a young woman crushed against a loading ramp. Miriam was at the infirmary when Daniel burst in, his uniform flecked with mud and his hands shaking. The wound was deep and dirty and might have cost an arm if infection set in. The scene of the injury was sharp with scent and sound. The metallic clatter of the ramp, the wet red smell of the wound, the whisper of cloth on skin. Daniel had a choice: follow orders and turn the injured back to the transport, or stay and help. He stayed. He washed the wound with a ration of boiled water, held the light steady while Miriam sutured. They argued softly over technique. "You are pressing too hard," Daniel said. "The suture will pull," Miriam answered. "I do not trust the supply list," Daniel said. "Then trust my hands," Miriam replied. The conversation was 5 exchanges long and included precise medical vocabulary explained briefly. When bandages were in place, Daniel sat outside the infirmary and listened to the wind as if cataloging a new element in his life. That night, he wrapped his polishing cloth around a small spent bulling and left it at Miriam's sewing board. She found it next morning hidden beneath a scrap of cloth. This small object became an index for future choices. The planning of an escape and a separation came like a slow fracture. Rumors of a selection where older men and women would be sent to a transport for unknown destination circulated like cold smoke. The camp held a mixture of partisans and those who once had been partisans and then lost that label. Among them were Jacob, who had worked tunnels in the hills, Ruth, who kept watch for German patrols, Marek, who spoke haltingly about routes to the forest, Yosef, who tended the communal oven, and Lena, who kept the registry at the annex. They gathered quietly in a lean-to and spoke of routes and timing. The tunnel was a plan of necessity. They would use a drainage culvert, widen it overnight, and move those most vulnerable. Miriam volunteered to make diversionary soup shifts. Daniel secured nails and a crowbar and cleared the path when sentries came near. The scene of planning smelled of wet earth and the iron tang of fear. The actual escape had sensory textures that gripped the throat. Hands scraping clay, the wet slap of boots against mud, the muffled creak of a tarp. There was a moment of separation at the mouth of the culvert when Miriam hugged the child and then turned to Daniel. "If we do not come back," she said, voice small. "Then I will find you," Daniel answered, pressing his forehead to hers. "Promise," she whispered. "Promise," he repeated. They were forced apart when a patrol arrived faster than expected. In the scramble, someone dropped a small box of letters and a button fell out into the mud. The button, brass and bent, would later be found and kept like a relic. Life beyond the camp diverged into the different fronts people had to walk. Daniel found himself reassigned with a small unit that was operating as part of a supply convoy. He felt the strain of loyalty to orders and the pull of a new moral gravity he had not anticipated. Miriam, with a group of refugees, found refuge in a kibbutz that welcomed refugees as laborers and as family builders. The kibbutz smelt of fresh bread and citrus and was full of tools and the sound of hammers. There she met other names who would matter. Sarah managed the orchard. Elias taught children to read from salvaged books. Aaron organized night watches, and Hannah sold flags from old material. Miriam adapted by offering her skills as a mender and as an informal nurse. Daniel worked clandestinely with partisans who moved along the edges of liberated towns, cutting supply lines. At one moment, he joined a small guerrilla cell to sabotage a bridge to prevent a mass transport. The tension was high, and the scene carried many sensory details. The bridge operation involved a metallic squeal of a loosened bolt, the scent of damp wood, the whisper of ropes, and a sudden volley of gunfire. Daniel was grazed by shrapnel. He survived, but the wound reopened old threads of fear. In captivity for a short time after a misstep, he learned what it meant to be suspected by those he wanted to save. Jacob and Marek risked their lives to pull him from a ditch when he fell. Each person named took a specific action. The density of small scenes built toward the possibility of reunification. The search that led to a reunion was not cinematic in a single scene, but was layered through letters smuggled by traveling nurses, a map folded into a bread wrapper, and the slow, patient work of people who owed debts. Miriam wrote in the margins of recipes the names of places where she might be found. Daniel kept polishing bullets and turning them into rings in secret, imagining them not as tools of death, but as shanks for promises. The re-encounter came in a spring orchard. The orchard was a place where survivors had planted trees, and the air smelled like blossom and new earth. They saw each other across a small grove of young trees, both with changes that time makes legible. Miriam's hands were calloused from bread making, and her tattoo showed slightly faded at the wrist. Daniel's face bore the new lines of someone who could not sleep easily. Their conversation that day lasted and deepened and contained 7 exchanges like beads strung in measured rhythm. "You made the rings," Miriam said, fingers closing around the small object he offered. "I made them from what remained," Daniel replied. "Why did you not tell me you were near?" Miriam asked. "Because I was afraid," Daniel said. "Afraid of what?" Miriam answered. "That you would not forgive me," he said. "Forgive you for what?" Miriam asked, palms steady. "For having a uniform," he said, voice thin. "The uniform is not the man," Miriam said. "Then be the man," Daniel smiled. They made a pact publicly that day by placing the rings on each other's fingers. The rings had been forged in a makeshift forger's corner of the kibbutz workshop where metal smelled like fire and oil and hope. The symbolic object transformed. They married in a curtailed ceremony with an orchard as witness. A simple exchange in front of Sarah, Elias, Aaron, Hannah, and Jacob, who all gave small readings or offers of bread. The marriage was a community event more than a private one, and the ring became an inheritance of shared labor. Marriage did not erase tests. War, or the remnants of war, returned in different forms. Daniel was called to help repair a convoy under threat and left for weeks. Miriam managed the children and the infirmary and was confronted by a smallpox scare that threatened to undo the fragile community. A medical team set up an emergency ward and the air grew thick with the scent of iodine and fever. They held on through scarcities of medicine. And through the bitter grief of losing a child to an infection. Daniel returned with a limp from stepping on an unexploded shell. They learned to transform trauma into routines of care. The tests were both external and internal. Social stigma followed. Some neighbors questioned their union because of histories and because of rumor mills that thrived in lean places. But the kibbutz absorbed and folded, and through labor and baking and tending the orange trees, the couple proved their belonging. Daniel returned to the forge and taught young men how to turn spent rounds into useful objects. Miriam kept a small registry at the annex and recorded births and small deaths. The community slowly redefined its memory. The objects persisted. The rings were kept in a small wooden box, and a bullet casing became a pendant worn by a child named Sarah who ran barefoot among the trees. At least 3 moments of tension stand out, each a crucible and each rendered in focused detail. The first was the near execution that followed an accusation in a ration line. Daniel had been accused of trading favors for ammunition. Men from a passing military tribunal arrived with papers and a stern look and intended to make an example. Miriam stood in the line and felt the world shrink to a point. The air smelled of cold metal and fear. They were taken to a yard where the tribunal read charges. Daniel faced them, hands clenched. He had to choose whether to confess to minor infractions he had committed in order to save others or to hold silence and risk punishment. He chose confession but refused to implicate those who had sheltered refugees. His truth moved an officer named Colonel Weber, who had also lost a sister, and, quietly, altered the course by granting a suspended sentence in exchange for work that would repair a bridge. The tension lasted in 3 compressed paragraphs and amounted to a moral test of duty versus empathy. The second moment was the bridge sabotage when Daniel and a partisan group detonated a support cable. The operation succeeded but invited reprisal. Noise hung in the air, the burn of cordite in noses, the shock of a nearby explosion that rattled teeth. They escaped with injuries and a narrow margin. The third was an epidemic that swept the kibbutz. It reduced the days to chores of tending the fevered and holding hands that were too hot, and gave the community a test of whether domestic rituals could withstand loss. Each moment of tension was written with close sensory detail and spanned 2 to 3 paragraphs to allow breathing room for the reader to feel the risk. Ritual and small acts of humanity persisted. Miriam sewed a small pocket into Daniel's coat to hold a pressed clump of time that reminded him of home. Daniel began to leave tools at the infirmary door with little notes written in pencil. People like Ruth and Elias began to tell the children's stories that reworked horror into parables about resourcefulness. The couple turned the bullets and fragments into wedding bands in a small forger's corner where Daniel insisted Miriam learn to read the forge. The forge smelled of iron and coal, and the heat put a glow on skin that felt like blessing. The rings were imperfect and thus perfect. They resembled a promise more than a polish. An epilogue unfolds in 3 moments that carry the legacy outward. 1 month after the wedding, the couple led a small harvest meal in the kibbutz. The bread was warm and shared between neighbors who now included former enemies and new friends. Sarah cut the first orange and handed a slice to a child who had not known what an orange tasted like before. The ring sat on Miriam's finger and reflected a soft golden light. The conversation that evening circled around plans to build a small schoolhouse and to send a parcel of tools to a nearby displaced persons camp. 3 months later, Daniel received a letter from his sister who had survived and who requested a record of his name for an annex at a regional registry. He walked to the office with the ring in his pocket and submitted a small note that would later help reunite other families. The letter smelled faintly of lavender and rain. 6 months later, the community gathered to dedicate a small showcase in the kibbutz common house. In the showcase, they placed the ring alongside a button found in the mud and a small register Miriam had kept. The community invited a historian to open the case and to read aloud names from the ledger. Grandchildren of those who had fought and labored attended, asking about stories and pointing at the objects with curiosity. The rings had evolved from instruments of war into heirlooms of repair. The epilogue totaled close to the length of a small testament, and closed with the thought that objects carry memory and that memory needs hands to keep it alive. Throughout the narrative, many other characters appear and act with specificity. Jacob tunneled to guide a small group to safety. Ruth kept watch on the ridge and warned of approaching trucks. Marek smuggled medicine in his coat and brought news from partisan cells. Yosef tended the oven and fed the hungry. Lena kept careful archives at the annex and later helped register births. Sarah managed the orchard and later taught children's songs. Elias taught reading classes and later became a schoolteacher. Colonel Weber made a choice that altered the course of a tribunal and later kept a letter that would explain his change of heart. Each of those figures has an action and sits within the texture of community. The conclusion draws the arc together in a few reflective sentences. What had begun as disparate gestures of survival became a visible inheritance. The woman with the faded tattoo and the soldier with the polishing cloth turned elements of violence into the fabric of home. The rings that had been bullets became symbols of repair and of the choices that people make when no one else provides options. The town that once smelled of smoke grew a grove of orange trees, whose blossoms carried scent into houses and onto the hands of children. The registry Miriam kept became a small archive that would one day be annexed into a municipal museum, where the ring and the button were displayed in a small vitrina case with a handwritten note. The community remembered that history is not only the record of battles, but a ledger of small favors. If this story moved you, please write in the comments a moment when a small gesture changed a life. And subscribe to hear more accounts from people who turned ruin into repair. Share this episode with someone who believes that the quiet acts of tending are as important as any victory. The metal cooled into a circle. From that circle came a lineage and a way to tell the future about what it takes to rebuild.